Don't you hate those introductions? And consultants, of course, are very good at padding out their bios. I say that as a consultant of 45 years, so I'm one of them. I'll give you some examples. About 2 years ago, I was with a group of my senior folks over meeting with the Americans in California, in San Francisco to be specific. And there was a 49ers game on the weekend before the meeting started, so we all decided we'd go down there. And of course their home stadium is at the bottom of Silicon Valley. So we stopped off at Stanford University because we needed to buy some caps. None of us had thought about the seating arrangements. When we looked at it the night before, we were going to spend all day with the sun pouring right down on us. So we figured the easiest way to stop and buy caps would be at Stanford. So what I did was I opened up an academic report and read it, so I can quite honestly say I have studied at Stanford. We also had a look around the Google campus, so I responded to an email, so I can honestly say I worked at Google. And somewhat more truthfully, I did actually debrief the culture survey for the European management group of Harley-Davidson a couple of years ago, and their European head office is in Oxford. So again, I could quite honestly say I have lectured at Oxford. But nonetheless, I have been in this business for a very, very long time. So I started in 1974, which is before most of you were born. And as I said in Christchurch, 45 years is a long time for you because it's probably longer than you've been alive. But for me, I'm still struggling with the fact that it's not January this year anymore. It seems to go quicker and quicker every year. But when I first started in 74, all of the HR people were men, and the vast majority of them were either ex-military or defrocked priests because they understood man management. That was the term that was used back then. So in a very short period of time, there has been incredible social change. And these norms, these expectations, these realities of the world that we live in are really what we're about. So what I want to do this morning is paint a picture for you of a model that we use to develop various stages of organisational consciousness and the implications that that has on transformation. So the background to the model, if I put it up and hopefully you can see that down the back of the room off those monitors, not to mention see me through the pillars. Okay. You may have heard of a guy called Dexter Dunphy, Professor Dexter Dunphy in Australia. If you've studied at the MBA, Dunphy and Stace is the standard textbook around organisational culture and leadership. And he has an even longer career than I have. He's in his late 80s and now retired and Professor Emeritus. But he developed some years ago what he called a stages of transformation model. It's a hypothetical model, and looking at the stages that organisations go through as part of their cultural development. He never really did anything with it. But we became interested when we had a situation arise that became very common experience, and that basically is an organisation would come to us, and I'm speaking specifically about Australia in this case, they would come to us and say, look, could you organise for us to talk to XYZ company, somebody who has transformed their culture? Because we'd like to find out what they're doing and how they did that. And so they would go, we would make that introduction, they'd go and talk to them, etc. But then about 6 months, 12 months later, they'd come back to us and say, we did that, we tried what they're doing and it didn't work. And this got us thinking around the levels of consciousness, because at that stage we were doing a lot of work with a bunch of neuroscience researchers as well, based around our individual thinking tool and the implications now where we can monitor how the brain cells adapt to different situations and thought processes, etc. But we became interested in this whole notion of consciousness. So what you've got is a bunch of, in that example, some people from a low consciousness, for want of a phrase at this stage, going and talking to a company where the leadership has very high levels of consciousness, looking at what they're doing, replicating it in this organisation here, and the organisation just isn't ready for that. They don't have the consciousness level to be able to deal with that. And so if you are ever talking, if you're on the start of a journey and you're talking to an organisation that's been there, done that, and has transformed into a constructive culture, don't talk to them about what they're doing now. Ask them what they did at the beginning of the journey 5 or 6 years ago, because their level of consciousness back then is possibly where you are now. So that was the point of developing the model. And so just to build the model for you, the bottom to top stuff is around defensive to constructive culture. So we want to look, as you go up the boxes, there's going to be more constructive styles evident in the culture. And left to right is the leadership commitment, the leadership consciousness, if you like. So it goes on the left-hand side from no belief to the right-hand side to commitment. And these words are very important because they create the 4 boxes for us, of where the bottom left-hand box is around stagnation, the top left-hand box is the organisation is at risk, the bottom right-hand box is unrealised potential, and sitting on the right-hand side of God is sustained performance at the top right-hand corner there. So that's a way of illustrating the interaction between leadership and organisational culture. Let me just step to one side for a moment, if I may, and I'll keep my eye on the timer, and share with you a very important concept, if you like, and a story to illustrate it. There are 2 quite distinct behavioural phenomenons in organisations. Organisational culture and organisational climate. And most people that talk about culture actually are talking about climate. Climate is what people experience within the organisation and how they feel about it. So there's 2 different aspects to climate. Do I think I get an adequate training to do my job well enough? Do I get involved in decisions that affect me? Do I understand how the recruitment and promotion process works? Is the goal setting process done in a way that I feel is good? So what do I see happening in the organisation? And then there's, of course, engagement, which is the common word used nowadays, around, so how do I feel about this? Do I feel it's a good place to work? Would I recommend it to people like me, etc.? That's all very important stuff to measure, collect data on, and we do that. We just don't specify engagement, for instance. But sitting alongside that is the notion of organisational culture. So organisational culture is not about what I experience, it's not about how I feel being part of the organisations, it's how I believe I am expected to behave. It's the organisational norms. And a norm defines what behaviour is acceptable or unacceptable in the organisation. So when you run a bank in Australia and you set up a sales management process where everything is about quota achievement right throughout the organisation, people will focus on achieving the quota, even if it means selling things to dead people, which is exactly what they did, which is why they had the Hayne Royal Commission and the report that came out of that. That's culture. At the risk of sounding slightly crude's not quite the right word, but I'll give you an illustration of a social norm. I'll give you 2 illustrations of social norms. The most common social norm you'll identify with is that it is not acceptable behaviour to fart in public. Agreed? That's a social norm. So we live our life with these norms. We don't know why that norm exists, and that's the reality in organisations as well. It just exists. So you ask yourself the philosophical question of why is it unacceptable behaviour to fart in public? We're allowed to cough in public, we're allowed to sneeze in public, but not fart in public, which is really interesting because if somebody in this room sneezes, somebody else is going to catch cold. But I've never read about anybody catching diarrhoea because somebody close farted, right? So these norms, often we don't know why they exist, etc. Another less basic one would be if you approached a table coming into this room and there was already another person sitting at that table, there's about an 85% probability you did not sit right next to them, you sat a chair away from them to give them, if it was a friend, you'd go and sit next to them. But look at the chairs in between people. That's a social norm. You give them space. So what we're interested in is what these social norms are in the organisations and how they affect performance, which is why when we talk about these 3 clusters, it's inevitable that if you develop a constructive set of norms, your organisation will perform more effectively than if the norms are founded in passive defensive or aggressive defensive styles. So what we want to do, I want to walk through the 6-stage model, look at the relationship with leadership, and then talk about some of the research behind the change program. So the first stage, We called it the denial stage. So each has a photographic metaphor, so that the three monkeys in human form, hear no evil, see no evil, etc. And each of the stages is going to be presented in a similar sort of way. So how would you describe that? There's no awareness or acknowledgement of the role of culture. The belief system is that it's airy-fairy. In responses, leaders are likely to oppose any initiatives related to cultural change, seeing it as a waste of corporate resources. And their time horizon is somewhat short-term oriented. And of course, culture is a leading indicator of organisational performance, where climate is a lagging indicator. So if you're measuring engagement, you're measuring the past and the present. If you're measuring culture, you're measuring the future. And so for want of an outcome, it's lack of sustainability really for those types of organisations. So the example that I will give you, and I referred to earlier around organisational climate and culture, really fits a denial stage organisation. So put your hand up if you've heard of Enron, just so that enough of you will know what I'm talking about. Okay. So Enron, if you're not familiar with it, were a very famous company in the 1990s, late 1980s. It started off in Houston, Texas, purchased a number of electricity organisations, got into the whole power grid transmission, futures, sales, turned into a semi-finance kind of organisation, and they were one of the most successful companies in the world in the late 1990s. And people wrote books about Enron. You can still buy them out there. The executive group were referred to as the brightest guys in the room because they were incredibly bright, but their culture was very, very aggressive defensive. They used, for instance, what became known as the rank and yank. So 10% of the employees got fired every year, the bottom 10% on the performance appraisal system, of the rank and yank. Okay? But anyway, they had undertaken a number of engagement surveys and climate surveys, and it showed them to be a great place to work for the 90% that made the cut. And people were very proud working with Enron. The famous illustration is the line worker that would wear his overalls to go shopping with the family at the local mall because it had Enron written on. Wow, you work with Enron. Wow, it must be an amazing place, because people have heard it in the news, they've read the books, they've seen the news articles, etc. And eventually, it was about 1998, they decided they'd have a look at their organisational culture, and they asked us to do a culture survey for them. So we did. And in scientific terms, it was the culture from hell. Totally green and red, and didn't challenge the blue inkjets in the printer very much at all. And I happened to be travelling to the US when the results were being presented at one of their satellite offices in California, in LA. And so I was asked to come along and sort of hold the chief executive's hand while he delivered the results, because it was never going to be easy. So they literally booed us off the stage. They said, this survey is absolute crap. I mean, we're so good they write books about us. We are the brightest guys in the room, blah, 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 blah. Your survey is obviously an absolute piece of rubbish because it's wrong. Now, the survey can't be wrong, because all it's doing is taking what the people in the organisation say and packaging it, really. So as I was walking off the stage, they fired us. As I was walking off the stage, one of them yelled out, so what do you think about it now? Now, that's how aggressive they were. And I turned to him and I said, look, we know that climate, and you seem to score very well on climate surveys, is a good predictor of short-term performance. So you're doing very well at the moment. But I need to tell you that culture is an excellent predictor of long-term performance. So someday, that culture is going to bite you in the bum big time. And about 2 years later, I opened the newspaper and there it is, Enron goes bankrupt. Chief executive, chairman, fronting federal courts, ultimately put in prison, etc. And so I said to them, the last expression I said was, I know that it will get you at some stage. I'm just not sure whether that's next year, 5 years' time, or 20 years' time, but it will. Culture determines your future. So this is classic denial stage thinking. So we looked at, we defined what we mean by denial, what would be the cultural characteristics of a leadership group that are in denial, etc. And then we plugged that into our data set of, at that stage, 2,065 organisations, and they came out looking like that, mostly avoidance, oppositional kind of behavioural norms, which is, keep yourself out of trouble, keep your nose clean, don't be in the wrong place at the wrong time. If you do get caught, blame somebody else, etc., etc. And 10% of organisations of that sample size fit that category. So the next is the non-responsive stage. So again, for want of a photographic metaphor, fantastic photograph, the local council at its very best. So for them, the description now is that there's some awareness of the role of culture, but it's not seen as a significant factor, but at least it's a bit of a step up. The belief system is somewhat around indifference. No real belief in the need to focus on culture. It's not seen as being relevant to performance. No to low commitment, there's lip service, no action actually takes place. Time horizon is still short term, and the outcome is the status quo. Slow to move, slow to change, and again, ultimately unsustainable performance over time. I see you taking photographs of the slides. I should tell you now that the slides will be made available after all the conferences are finished through our website. And again, we went back into the data set with definitions, etc., and 42% of organisations average looking like that and fit that definition of non-responsive. The third stage, the compliance stage, so the good or bad, right or wrong, tick the box, compliance. Compliance is really, again, if you follow organisational culture and stuff in the media, and you've read about the Hayne report in Australia, the Bank Financial Services investigation, Royal Commission, etc., they're putting all these cultural change actions out there for the banks to do, but it's actually all about compliance. It's got very little to do with culture and behavioural expectations in the organisation. It's about compliance requirements with the authorities, which probably should have been there in the first place. And it's not for naught that one of the regulators actually has been described as having a toxic culture in the media. So the good, bad stuff. So there's a desire to measure culture as information gathering, not in terms of we're measuring this because we're going to work on it, we're measuring it because we're curious as to what it looks like. The belief system is it's sort of nice to have, and it's consistent with the conventional practices of data collection. And it's increased commitment at the top, but focuses on culture as an HR issue, secondary to a focus on the real business. This is the challenge for you if you're in HR, is that culture is not just about a great place to work or a nice place, got nothing to do with being a nice place to work, in fact, but it is about the ability and capability of the organisation to develop and improve its performance. You cannot improve performance with a defensive culture. You can with a constructive culture. So the time horizon now is moving through into the medium term. They're starting to think ahead, but they're still locked into this culture as an HR issue. It is a business issue, and it's important, and I do believe this quite sincerely, that again, if you're in HR at senior level, one of the things that I hear time and time again, I mean, I've been in consulting now since 1974, that's 45 years. I've been a member of the Human Resources Institute in New Zealand, the Institute of Personnel Management, before that, since 1975, and I keep on top of some of this stuff, right? Now, every year, I mean, in 1974, the big topic for the HRI&Z discussion at the conference was how do we make HR strategic, recognise as strategic in the organisation? So that was the goal then. Last week, I now sit on a research advisory panel for the Australian Human Resources Institute, so we have our quarterly meeting where we look at research that's going on in the HR practitioner field. And once again, one of the surveys showed the biggest need, the biggest gap, the strongest need for people in HR at the senior level is to be seen as being strategic in the organisation. That's 45 years, and we're still talking about the same issue. Culture gives HR that opportunity, because culture is not an HR responsibility, it's a business responsibility. So if you can work with the members of the so-called C-suite around the reality of organisational culture, implications for performance, how it affects performance, that will give you a strategic seat at the table, I assure you. So the outcome for this compliance stage is assessment It's not about change or transformation, it is about assessment. And again, we went into the data, the 2,000 odd, and 19% of organisations look like this. So you're starting to see a combination of the green, red with the blue. The blue is going up just a little bit. The fourth stage, the efficiency stage, and again, for want of a photographic metaphor, the soon to be stopped by Donald Trump, Chinese manufacturing operations. The description here is there's a belief for the need to change, but it means adapting. It's incremental type change rather than transformational change. Its measurement is relevant to optimising human capital. Transformation change at this stage is not yet envisaged. And they're interested in the results of the measurement as a means of determining how effectively their systems and processes are working. Time horizon's getting well into the medium and starting to look at the longer term now. They're interested in cause and effect, analytic problem solving, etc. And the outcome is incremental change designed to optimise systems and processes. And it's focusing on improving KPIs. Again, transformational is not there yet. Data, 12%, starting to see more blue, but there's still quite a bit of the green and red. And by the way, that is in itself a constructive culture. So as we move through, the next is strategic proactivity. For want of a photographic metaphor, the notion of the conductor, who probably doesn't even work or live here. They fly in from Germany or something, they bring together 50 people who have disparate individual skills and capabilities and turn it into that marvellous symphony that you go to listen to. It's an extraordinary skill. So the description here is the business case for change has been now clearly articulated. It's not about a burning platform, and you remember that even the guy who created the metaphor of the burning platform said people don't understand what I was trying to say. A burning platform by definition is a defensive manoeuvre rather than a constructive one. So it's looking at how we can use culture, our culture, because you have one, whether you know it or not, you've got one. It's a question of whether it's hindering or helping you. How do we use that knowledge of our culture to ensure that it is helping us, not hindering us? So it's well articulated, committed. Change is seen as an ongoing process. So again, vernacular nomenclature is important. Don't call culture a project or a program, because that suggests it has a beginning and an end. It does, it never ends. Whether you do anything about it or not, it's going to be there. It's a question of whether you're controlling it or it's controlling you. So the belief system now is it's seen as integral to measuring higher levels of productivity. The leaders' response to it is they're all strong advocates and they see change as beginning with themselves. So again, the time horizon now is very much through to the longer term, and for want of an overall description, transformational change is valued at this point and delivers results. So it is about transformative experience. And we figure about 14% of organisations sit in that category. Last and not least, the sustaining or resilient stage. And again, for want of a photographic metaphor, the notion of sailing. You cannot control the wind, you can control what you do with the wind, right? So it's how well you adapt and proact and react and all that sort of act stuff. So the description of the leadership consciousness at this stage is the case for ongoing change is seen as integral to the organisation's ongoing commitment to the developing economy and society. So that last few words are absolutely critical in this stage. The organisation has moved beyond simply being concerned with itself to being concerned with its role in society. Whether that is an alcohol company becoming concerned with how do we stop misuse of the product, whether it's companies who have natural environmental negative impacts as a consequence of what they do as a business, so therefore how can we mitigate some of that, etc. They're stepping out of the organisation and saying, how do we help the world and our society or our part of the world perform effectively? So culture change becomes a conscious development process, if you like. And the leader's belief and commitment becomes fully integrated as a personal value. It's not just the right thing to do, it's what you do. Time horizon now is very much long-term sustainable performance, and the outcome description is short, medium, long-term focus, excuse me, the organisation respects and is responding to its role in society. In fact, it's defining its role in society. And we reckon about 2% of organisations sit there. So there's the percentages alongside the model. And you'll see that if we have this sort of theoretical line through the middle of the boxes, 72% of the organisations sit below that line, 28% above. And some sort of descriptors to put some meat around those bones. So for those organisations in the final 3 stages, change is a challenge. So if we are experiencing disruption, it's a challenge. It gives us something to respond to. Whereas for those below the line, challenge is a threat. And so threats are there to be avoided. Rewards and opportunities versus threats and risks. So keep in mind we were working with a bunch of neuroscientists at this stage. So if you're familiar with the likes of David Rock's work, the SCARF model, etc., then they talk about rewards and opportunities versus threats and risks. Ideas versus anxiety. So this is one of the key things that a constructive culture does, is it frees up the human brain to think creatively rather than how do I not get in trouble here. Okay? And psychological safety is paramount for individual well-being. Commitment versus control. And last but not least, assumptions are positive and assumptions are negative. So this idea of assumptions, I mean, we're all taught not to make them, but in fact we make them all the time. So in all probability, you've got some plans for this evening, predicated on the assumption you'll still be alive this evening, right? We live our life with these assumptions. They are a reality. So therefore, the culture influences what those assumptions are and how they work. So again, for want of a very silly, simple illustration, if this is my staff group, whatever level I'm at, team leader, C-suite, and I come in first thing in the morning and I look really, really pissed off. And I ignore all of you and I go into my room and slam the door, or I go to my corner and just hunker down behind the screen. In a constructive organisation, the assumption will be something like, oh, shit, Shaun got out of the wrong side of the bed this morning, didn't he? In a defensive organisation, the assumptions are going to be, oh my God, what's wrong now? See the difference? Very important. Subtle, but important. If I want some numbers around that, those 28% of organisations in the top, 30% higher satisfaction, 80% higher role clarity, 31% better adaptability to external changes, 31% higher quality service. The bottom line, 60% more stress, 70% higher job insecurity, and 13% more likely to leave the organisation. So that's the first step, developing these stages of transformation based on levels of consciousness of the organisation. So as the first slide said, try and figure out where you are as I go through the presentation. If you're sitting down the sort of the bottom 3, don't aim for the top one, aim for the one next up the tree, and I'll talk to that very shortly. So the next step was using the leadership impact data, and I believe Neil will talk to you about leadership impact this afternoon. Leadership impact is an instrument where I ask my direct reports, and perhaps others, to give me feedback on how they believe they are expected to behave as a consequence of how I lead them. So they're not describing me, they're describing their own behaviour, but as a consequence of how I lead them. So do I make you think you should avoid, or compete, or be tough, or solve problems, or help one another, etc., etc. And so we decided to look into the leadership levels of consciousness within those 2,065 organisations. So we started with the same model, but we added another line, the blue one. So it goes from psychological straitjacket through to psychological flexibility, because we're talking about individuals now rather than organisations. So again, we created a 6-stage model. The myopic visioning. Picture says it all, right? The next stage we call blinkered visioning. So not quite myopic, but still not open to opportunities, open to thoughts, creative solutions, etc. The next stage we called conventional visioning. So this time round there's a sense of complacency about the organisation. We might be a market leader, we might be quite big, we're doing quite well, etc. But again, the thinking's still somewhat inside the box, and it's about upholding the setting. So the next group we called strategic visioning. So now we're getting above the line, we're getting into goal-directed, analytic, changing the setting, starting to influence the environment within which the organisation operates. Through to the next stage, proactive visioning. So we're now starting, the leaders are looking at the bigger picture, they're becoming significantly more focused on how they impact the organisation, and they're actually challenging the setting. So let's challenge our own organisation, our business model, etc., etc. And the last but not least, the total visioning. And so this is the notion of self-agency. This understanding the impact that I have on others and understanding how I influence how you behave. This notion of self-agency, reflexivity. The one thing that we know distinguishes us from animals is that we can think about how we think. And we very rarely do that. And that's the point of this exercise, is to think about how we think. So the total visioning, for instance, we published a book in 2006 called In Great Company, and we looked at 5 organisations, I think it was, 4 or 5, I think 5, as case studies. They had transformed their cultures. So we worked with Professor Dexter Dunphy that I mentioned in the introduction to look at what these organisations had done. So we are quantitative researchers, he's a qualitative researcher, put together a bunch of PhDs. They went out and talked to these organisations to basically answer the question, what did you do to change your culture? And that became a business bestseller, and we've republished that again after the GFC to see what those organisations look like and how they experienced the GFC, and have they continued to grow and build their culture? And the answer is yes, they have, by and large. So then, I'm stuck, Dean. Okay, they're coming up, thank you. The numbers. Now, you may recall, if you have fantastic memory, that when I showed you the leadership consciousness model, there were 72% of organisations below the line. It's 71% of leaders below the line. It's not a manufactured number, that's the way it fell out. So again, outcomes, those are more likely to be, they're rated as enhancing other people's productivity, more likely to be described as visionary, more likely to bring the best out of people, versus more likely to be overrated as a leader, more likely to be enjoying more authority than warranted, and more likely to be rated as advancing own success rather than advancing the firm's success. So we can see the implications running through there. Now, because the numbers fell out so similarly, that's the right word, yeah, we decided to go another step, and that is to now look at, through the data, the relationship between the organisation and the leader. In other words, if he is a myopic visioning leader, did he happen to work in a denial stage organisation or it's not perfect. Any research that comes out perfect is probably bullshit. But he would be in a non-responsive or a denial or around that area type organisation. And it was so sort of, oh my God, that the art folks developed this particular graphic for us. I'm not a huge fan of the graphic itself because DNA suggests that you can't change, and you can. But nonetheless, the linkage was there all the way from the bottom of the model to the top of the model. So we now know that the organisational consciousness, as reflected in the leadership consciousness, is very much reflected in the individual senior executive's consciousness. Okay? So now the third step was to begin to look at how those organisations went through the change process and moved up that model. So this is the 6-stage model again, designed to represent how big is the gap between each stage, how hard is it to get from one to the other. And so you can see there's a little bit of a gap between denial and non-responsive, but there's a very big gap between the non-responsive and the next. Then there's a little step, then there's a big step, and then there's a little step. So there's a couple of critical points in there in between the first 2, the second 2 to the third 2 that are quite substantial steps. And of course it's not linear, the model is linear because it's a theoretical model. And for want of an analogy, I mean, having grown up on a farm north of the Hokianga and Uruguay a long time ago, I sort of think about those first two are like you're stuck in the mud. You've got your gumboots on, the mud's up to here, etc. And the only way you can move forward is to get your leg out of the gumboot. But you actually want to take the gumboot with you. So it's that getting out of the mud, getting out of the quagmire of a very defensive culture that we're sort of stuck in. Right? And there may be a number of different reasons why we are stuck in that. I'll give you the banks as an illustration, having mentioned the Royal Commission. I mean, we have data on the Australian banks, and the cultures are fundamentally aggressive defensive. That should come as no surprise, given what came out in the Royal Commission, so I'm not giving away any privacy stuff. But the common response has been, but we need to be like that to perform in this particular market. That's misattribution of success and misunderstanding of culture. So, moving up through these stages, remember I said if you're down the bottom, don't aim for the top, aim for the next one. So we've clustered them together. Right? So if you're in the denial or non-responsive stage, aim for the compliance stage. Aim for the efficiency stage, aim for the strategic proactivity stage. So what did they do? What sort of levers for change did these organisations work on? Now, not all of them did this. The disclaimer that hopefully you had a quick look at before I moved on to the model, I should reflect on that for a moment, because there is no one size fits all. It's what's called, it's a bit of a technical term, but intervention specificity. So you have to design specific interventions for your organisation. There is no do these 10 things and you will have a constructive culture. It is simply too complex. But this is typically what these organisations worked on. So a sense of purpose, a common understanding of who we are, why we are, where we are and what we are. So otherwise known as articulation of mission. Getting people involved, and you'll see stories of that as the day progress. Getting employees involved and being able to influence what goes on. Leadership development, of course, is given that DNA-looking thingy, leadership development is an integral part of it. Job design. Now this is a very interesting phenomenon. Job design is how much autonomy, variety, identity, significance and feedback is there in the job. And what I've seen in my 45 years, I mean, consultants in 1974 were called efficiency experts, by the way. God forbid, no. And of course there was the old joke about watch out when a management consultant asks you the time, because they'll borrow your watch, tell you the time and then sell it back to you. Which is what we did. We lurked around corridors and we talked to people and we read notes and then we said this is what you should do. People who know best what to do are actually doing it. They just haven't been asked the right questions. And so that's the whole organisational development process, is to get it internally driven, not by some external expert. But nonetheless, how did I get onto that tangent? I'll move on. Job design. What I've seen in the 45 years is autonomy, variety, identity, significance and feedback reducing. Because technology drives how the jobs get done rather than humans. So technology is taking the fundamental cause of motivation out of the jobs. That's doing two things. One, it's why the big global engagement survey people tell you every year in their global engagement survey review that globally engagement is not going up. It's not going up because we keep taking this motivational stuff out of the job. The second thing it does is it creates huge responsibilities for those in supervisory positions to motivate people, because the jobs themselves aren't motivating. So I urge you, as one very common intervention is around job design, is to have a look at the stuff that's there. The best source still is the original source. It was written, I think, in 1981 or 1982, a book called Work Redesign by two very, very famous professors called Hackman, H-A-C-K-M-A-N, and Oldham, O-L-D-H-A-M. And both of them developed this motivational potential model within job design. The goal emphasis, the communication, and at sort of the general level, widen their understanding about culture and create curiosity. So moving through to the next level, What did they do next? The focus now was on the HR system, so clarity, transparency, open understanding around how the T&D system, the recruitment system works, etc. And what we call respect for members, typically called diversity. I mean, we don't call it diversity, it's just a fundamental form of respect, which has got absolutely nothing to do with the colour of your skin or whatever. Right? The reinforcement systems, the fairness of appraisals, the use of punishment, use of praise stuff. Goal setting, more job design, continue leadership development, and continue everything done earlier and look for ways to link culture to the performance data. So we urge you, and I'll take this opportunity to urge once again, if you talk to us about setting up a culture survey within your organisation and establishing baseline data, we urge you to go through the thought process of what are some of the organisational outcomes that can be influenced by that culture, and let's start looking at that stuff from the get-go. Right? Because it does. And the last couple of stages, now it's again, keep doing what you've been doing. I mean, that's why I get rid of the words program and project. But again, at a general level, build the case for culture as an organisational responsibility. It is not an HR issue anymore. Alignment, bring the outside in, and integration is the important key themes through there. And that's it from me. Thank you very much.